Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Practically Platonic. I'm Jeffrey. Hi, Sylvia. How are you doing?
Hi, I'm doing well. So today we're going to be discussing on love, which is section 3.5 or 50 of the original chapters as laid out by Porphyry. So this chapter overall investigates the question of what exactly is love? What is this phenomena? And he relies heavily upon the Symposium and aspects of the Phaedrus by Plato, and kind of dissects Plato's stories within, especially the Symposium. There is a section in which there is a mythological story laid out of a dinner amongst the gods in Zeus's garden, and it describes the birth of love. And Plotinus takes that story and breaks down the mythology into abstractions that correspond to his worldview and his metaphysics. And he also talks about the difference between the earthly love, such as love associated with sex and marriage, and the higher level love, which of course is that love which then orients us toward the good, right? And he talks about how there's different aspects, or I guess subcategories, of love as it's manifested for us here in the material world. There's the higher love, which is akin to a god, and then the individual love that each of us can experience, either through our relationships with others or marriage, and also the loftier aspect of love. But the way that each of us experience it is something that he finds to be more akin to a daimon, so a lower level experience of love through the descended soul in each of us. And also he does mention that any soul, even those souls that are not corporeal, have a love. So I suppose that also extends to daimons and other spiritual entities that exist within the worldview that he has. But let's just get into discussing each section as it's broken down. Well, first he poses the question, is love an affection? And I think by that he means simply a behavior, a sentiment, or is it a god, or is it a daimon? He does say that it is, in a sense, also an affection in the way that we feel when we are oriented toward beauty, the emotion, the sensation we feel. And then he starts further describing the difference between love as a daimon and love as a god. And he gets more into the details of the god aspect as we move forward. But
throughout this chapter, he makes a distinction between the divine and the daimon, because this is also an important distinction that has to be made, because if there is any sort of interaction with the material world directly, then it, strictly speaking, cannot be a god or a goddess. In that way, you have to consider also the cosmology that we've discussed at length. And as Plotinus has discussed at length in this book, there is the intellect, there is the soul, and then there is the material world. So he's making this division between these different levels. So my understanding of this is that there is as you said, a daimon that interacts with people, and the result of that is the sort of worldly affections, interest in things like marriage, sex, those sort of worldly affections. And then there is the divine love, which is effectively the intellect, or the soul rather, orienting itself toward the good, back to the intellect.
Right. And I guess to break those, he refers back to mythologies of Aphrodite, two different mythologies, to differentiate those two concepts. One, he talks about Aphrodite, I believe the one born of Zeus, he references as the earthly Aphrodite, which is, love as we know it, as a romantic and physical and filial love. And then the Aphrodite born of Cronus is this divine love, which I don't really recall what the differentiation is, or not what the differentiation is. I don't recall the origins of the Cronus mythology around Aphrodite, what he's referring to there, versus I'm obviously familiar with the idea of Aphrodite and Zeus. I guess the one with oh, right, sorry. So I guess it's because the story that Cronus, that Aphrodite was born of the sperm of Cronus in the sea, so sort of self-born, is why it's tied to this divine aspect, correct? Versus the birth of Aphrodite as an actual result of Zeus's marriage.
So on page 295 in the translation, Plotinus says, we say that Aphrodite is actually double. The one who is heavenly, we say, is the daughter of heaven, and the other born of Zeus and Dione, who has to do with marriages in this world as their overseer. The former is motherless and transcends marriages because there are no marriages in heaven. And this is where he goes on to say that the heavenly Aphrodite, said to be the child of Kronos, whose intellect must be most divine soul born directly from him, who is pure and remaining above.
Okay, well, that's interesting because he later then associates the concept of intellect with the Zeus. But I guess he's not really very hard and fast tied to the gods as being anything specifically. He's just taking it in the context of mythologies that they're represented in, even when they're separate stories, where perhaps in a certain cosmology or story of mythology, he sees Cronus as representative of intellect, and then in a different situation, a different story, a different aspect of mythology is presented, it's Zeus. And then I guess we have to always remember that he was probably privy to more texts than we are now, as far as what was, at least currently, or even for him, the historical mythologies of the Greek, right? Whereas we have very few texts relatively left to us to really know what the ideas were or what the historical ideas were around these.
Right. And also, he's not dogmatic because he doesn't take the mythology quite literally.
Exactly.
And, well, I mean, Kronos is the predecessor to Zeus.
Right.
So I guess, but I mean, I don't know how mythologically you would interpret the downfall of Kronos if he's the intellect. That would be an interesting sort of creative interpretation. How do you go from Kronos to Zeus ruling over intellect? But I don't think that was really a concern.
Right. Yeah, because even within the context, and I don't want to get too far from the topic, but even within the context of the stories as we know them, of the mythology, of the origins of the gods, and I'm sure there are experts out there who have good answers for this or have some sort of answer for this, but the downfall, what the Titans represented, what Cronus represented, and his downfall at the hands of Zeus is somewhat incongruent with the fact that then there's also the storyline of the various ages of man, the demigods being so blessed that they continue to live in a golden age, or they continue to live, a perfect existence in the kingdom of Kronos, which Zeus then gave him back a kingdom, or the idea that the golden age was under Kronos, which is incongruent with other aspects of the way the story of Kronos has been presented, or as we have it today, right?
Right.
So we're not going to try to understand that in a literalist manner.
Mm-hmm. Right. We don't have to understand it literally because, I mean, the discussion here is really about the two forms of love that.
Right.
Really,
so I suppose he's taking different stories where Aphrodite was presented in slightly different lights and using them as examples of the different kinds of loves that exist fundamentally.
Right. So he does, and so this is, once he gets into his actual discussion of love, this also inevitably has to touch on matters of sexuality. So, for example, on page 294 in the translation, he says, and for those who are self-controlled, the affinity with what is beautiful here is not a moral error, whereas a collapse into involvement with sex is a moral error. So I don't think he's advocating so much celibacy, but as he explained in earlier chapters regarding materiality, any sort of vice is ultimately a product of matter or entanglement with it or desire for it. So inevitably, desire for sex is also going to be wrapped up with matter. And so the love that's generated from sex is different from a pure love that is directed toward the good.
And he also does differentiate, at least my interpretation of what he's saying at the bottom of that page, is when he's talking about the love for women, which then generate, children, he thinks that, even though there is that sexual aspect, which is material, it's sex with a purpose. Where there's a double, perhaps, I think he may insinuate it later, but the double aspect of the affectation of actual caring and love for the woman, but also the result of the love being reproduction, which he then ties back to what Diotima says to Socrates in the Symposium, as far as, since we are mortal beings, and as are all animals, our attempt to grasp at, I guess I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but let me just finish the thought, that since love is eternal, love is an aspect of love is eternal, and it is in the intelligible realm, which we don't really have access to in our mortal bodies. And since we cannot be the good, our only way of which would then insinuate that we need to be eternal, and we're not. The only attempts that mortal beings can have is eternity through reproduction, right? The continuation of the line through biological means of our essence. And in that sense, therefore, he sees love with the opposite sex, or sex with the opposite sex, for the purpose of reproduction and lineage, as being an affection of love in this mortal world, versus just unhinged sex with either sex for no purpose other than pleasure.
Mm-hmm. Right. I think that's a good assessment of this. I mean, he does say on the bottom of page 294, just kind of you summarized what he said, but he explicitly says, but if it is love for other than women, they are making a mistake.
Yeah.
So effectively what he is saying, that same-sex sexuality, in his opinion, is mistaken.
Yes.
And I mean, he's coming from an era where effectively, like, bisexuality, as we would call it, was the norm.
Right.
And so this is something that he believes is mistaken. But that's what you also find in a lot of religious and philosophical thinking from antiquity as well. I mean, for example, Zoroastrianism, they were very much opposed to any sort of same-sex relations between men. As far as I know, they don't mention same-sex relations between women. But of course, in the Greek world, the Greek-speaking world, the Hellenistic world, there was certainly a very lively culture of sexuality between men and women, or men and men and women and women. So this is the sort of context where he's making this statement. But it really ties in with his ideas on how matter is the source of vice.
Right.
So if you're engaging with matter for the sake of pleasure, then this is basically drawing you away from the good, drawing you away from the one, and then orienting you back toward matter. So this is almost as much a, what do you say, almost sort of like a contemplative point as it is something that's like tied up with lineage and reproduction. So it does fit with his earlier comments about matter.
It does, yes. I think this is less of something that would be seen as the sort of moralistic abnormality viewpoint that maybe we're accustomed with Christianity, that's against same-sex. And this really has more purely to do with what he thinks the actual nature of love is. And because I think the idea of a man or a woman having, a bunch of sex with the opposite sex as well, for no purpose other than pleasure, to him would also be a mistake. No less than with the same sex.
Yeah, I mean, he does explicitly say for women, in order to perpetuate the race. So he's saying that sex should be used for reproduction. I mean, by extension, presumably, he would also be opposed to masturbation for the sake of masturbation.
Probably.
Right. And I mean, I coming from like a Buddhist background in my past years, the same sort of sentiments are expressed there, where they don't necessarily have a moral objection to same-sex coupling, in the same way that, like, for example, Christianity does, because it's not like,
or some factors of Christianity,
or some factions of Christianity, but rather that if you're just engaging in sex for the sake of pleasure, then you're orienting yourself more and more toward desire.
right?
So that would include, for example, coupling with a prostitute is also problematic in a Buddhist moral context, because you're doing that just for the sake of pleasure. Whereas, and so it's something that, like, if you have a worldview in which desire and sort of physical pleasures associated with matter are drawing you away from some sort of higher metaphysical good or some sort of contemplative goal, then your options logically are either, procreating for the sake of perpetuating the human race, or celibacy. And those are not necessarily exclusive, because once you've conceived children, then you could conceivably also engage in celibacy. You could commit yourself to celibacy. And in some Buddhist cultures, and today, I mean, people sometimes do that as well. They're married, but then they just decide to be celibate after they've had their children. I don't know how common that is, but I mean, I've read about it.
Yeah, I mean, even though the result, or maybe the morality, has similar or the same results, it's really the difference between a worldview in which you should not do something because it is judged an abomination by some sentient God, versus simply the practicality of, you're not going to be judged by some God for doing this. It's just, there's by necessity certain consequences or results might occur, almost as if they were natural phenomena, right? Whether or not you choose to focus on the good, or if you focus on the material. I don't think he gives this particularly more or less importance. I may be wrong, I'm not there, but he may be giving this no less or more importance than other aspects of material and pleasure that he thinks people should not overdo. I didn't really get a sensation that there was much of a taboo around sex any more than any other aspect of material pleasure that one can partake in this chapter. He kind of touches on this, but then he moves on to what he thinks is more important. It's not really like a pulpit preaching chapter on you shouldn't have sex except for kids. He really just touches on it on this page, and then the rest of this is really more of a literary analysis of Plato's mythologies around love and what he thinks it means.
Mm-hmm.
And then kind of what that means for us.
Right.
Yeah. So do we want to get into some of that he gets into, as far as love as it is connected to the world soul versus the individual love we can have, and the difference between it being a divine and a daemon, and also the relationship of all the aspects of that mythology story where there's Zeus in the garden with the gods, and the birth of love, and what he thinks that actually means in a conceptual sense, versus it just being a mythology story.
Right. Okay. So my interpretation of what we read in this chapter is that this is also a description of the expression of the forms from the intellect to the soul to the material world. And so he says that nature is an expression of beauty, with a capital B in the English translation. So he says nature comes into being from the intelligible world, from the good, and clearly from beauty. If anyone is in love with and akin to anything, he is drawn also to its images. So this is the higher, or maybe the highest form of love, where we are deprived in a way, and we yearn for and love that which we do not have, which is basically the intelligible realm, the forms. And
I'm sorry to interrupt. And I guess going to the story, which maybe we'll cover in a little bit, where in the mythology story, the reference to plenty is those express principles of the intelligible forms, which we can not really have in here. And that's why there's the other side, which he says it is born of plenty and poverty. Love it.
Yes. Yes.
I'm sorry, go on. I think I interrupted your thought process there.
So that's the higher form of love. But then there's also the lower form, which is, as you pointed out, the sort of worldly affections that we experience.
Right. So the story that we're dancing around is in section 3.5.8 of the version that we're reading. And he kind of breaks down, and you've already discussed some of this, but just so we can underline what some of the connections he makes. He says that basically, as we've already discussed, Aphrodite, who is the mother of love in a sense, but therefore Aphrodite is representative of the soul. And the plenty, or the concept you just were talking about of the descent of the intelligible forms is tied. And then to that, there's the express principles which I guess those are the same things, right? The express principle of all things are the intelligible forms, right? Or are those two different things?
The logos.
That's what it is?
Yeah.
Okay. And he says in the story where it says that, so in the story, there's a party happening in a garden that Zeus is throwing this party. And at this party, plenty and poverty, I guess, give birth to love with Aphrodite. That's my understanding. And the garden itself, I think, is supposed to be all, and in the book it says it's all the glories of the express principles. So the garden is actually, I guess, the realm of the intelligible, and Zeus is representative of the intellect, as we said earlier in the episode. And Aphrodite is the soul, and the soul's interaction with the express principles, and I guess to some degree also matter, creates the two types of love which we've described up to this point.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's one of the more interesting I guess interactions with Plato's extant work that he's had so far, in my opinion, where he's actually doing quite sophisticated analysis of another piece of important work and breaking it down in a way that is, I think, I think is really good. I don't feel like he's quite done that as clearly or with quite as much result yet in previous chapters that we've covered. Even if he does refer to other works by Plato, he either fully just agrees or disagrees, but I don't see quite the level of analysis. And when he has had it, he hasn't been quite as clear as, he's not the clearest writer or the clearest orator, I suppose. These were written, I guess he did write them. He wrote most of it, and some of them are Porphyry's notes. So I thought that was very interesting. And the story that he refers to and that we're referring to, if you want to go read it, if you haven't already read it, is in the Symposium, which in its own right, of course, is a great book. And really, I think everyone should read as many of Plato's works as possible, if not all of them, before even moving on to trying to read this stuff, or at least reading them in at the same time.
So let me ask you, after reading this chapter, how has your view on love changed or not?
I don't know that it's changed so much my view on love. It's changed my understanding of the Symposium. So I think I have a better understanding of Plato, or at least, I think I have a better understanding, or I have of that book. Whether or not it's what Plato meant or not, I'm not sure, but it resonated with me the way he did an interpretation. And obviously that's just one of the various stories in the Symposium. Well, actually it touches kind of on two of them. There's the story, which I forget which speaker tells the story of the garden. I think it's one of the poets. And that aspect, speaks more to the love that is divine. And then there is Socrates' own retelling of Diotima's explanation of love, which also touches upon orienting toward the good, but it also elucidates the whole idea of sex and love, earthly love, and why we have sex, and why giving birth and the continuation of lineage is really our attempt at eternity, to be as similar and orient ourselves toward the good and love. So I guess, I don't know if it's really changed how I see love. I don't know that I feel that, I guess he did. I'm just not sure that he ever got around to actually saying what love is, more than where it's from or how it interacts or how it differs from the good. I guess it's the way we feel the good, the way that we can experience the good is love. So I guess through that optics, it's pretty much in line with, for the most part, where I'm at right now. It made me think about my concept of love insofar as the way we can love the work we do, and by that especially like any sort of work that's tied to artistic creativity, or any creativity. It doesn't have to be art, but true creativity or true thought. But I think especially when there's some aspect of creativity, the passion of the scientist or the inventor or the artist or the thinker, I think that feeling of aliveness that it gives you, that's love. That's approaching or in the direction of the kind of divine love that he's saying we should feel, that as we orient ourselves toward the good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I found that he didn't really define what love is, and it's also when he's speaking, he's clearly speaking to men, where
Yeah,
he says, sex with a woman, and presumably that's a heteronormative statement where he's talking to another man, where, it's very much a male-centric understanding.
I would assume though that he would say that the inverse is also applicable,
Right.
that women should probably only be having sex with men to have kids and not have gay sex. I mean, I thought that he did have some females in his school or in his close group of people, and he didn't seem, for his period of time, he didn't seem overtly misogynistic to me from what I've read of what we know of him. But of course, he's writing this for his audience, which is mostly male. And again, we really don't know what the original text said, because these texts, again, they're handed down over generations of people transcribing. So,
right. I mean, probably his intended audience for the most part was his students, and they were probably predominantly men. So that's just something to keep in mind when you read this. Yeah, I mean, the question of love is interesting for me as well. I mean, I understand where he's coming from here, where if you're coming from a contemplative perspective, and I mean contemplative as in meditative, and you're basically trying to orient yourself away from vice and all of the sort of causes for vice, which are material, then you have to understand that mundane affections, worldly love, any sort of desire for physical affections, if you indulge them, it's going to basically draw you back to matter. So ultimately, if you want to ascend, then you have to orient yourself back to the intellect. And so that would in his model of thinking, of his model of spiritual practice, it would necessitate that you effectively don't indulge in sex. It doesn't necessarily, from what he's saying, it doesn't mean like absolute monastic celibacy. It's just avoid it. Just in the same way, like you could enjoy you can have wine in order to nourish yourself and to hydrate yourself, but you don't, drink the whole bottle of wine just for the sake of getting drunk and enjoying yourself, right?
I think there's also more nuance in what he's writing where he touches upon love as we experience it toward a romantic partner or even just family. I think there's an underlying understanding there that the way we should be loving at the divine level should also inform how we love within our material life. that the love that we have for our partner, for example, should not be one that's where you're interacting with the person purely for sex, but that you should be able to start seeing that person with the eye of someone that sees the oneness of the
Hmm.
good, and that the relationship you have with your parents or your siblings and your friends, that the way you love them should be where you're loving them not just as particulars, but because you see in them those overarching truths, right? Much like when he talked about beauty, and he's talking about not just moving on from just loving like individual bodies or individual people's attractiveness, or even like other kinds of beauty and charm, but being able to see the beauty everywhere. And if it's everywhere, it's probably in each descended soul, in each person that you're in contact with. So I think there's an underlying message there of approaching even your material loves with the heart of the divine love.
Right. And
I'm
it
sure.
also,
I don't think he would disagree with him if I brought this up to him, even though he doesn't explicitly say it. I feel like it's woven into this chapter to some degree.
yeah, and I mean, from his perspective, you have the world soul. And
Right.
so ultimately, we're all descended souls of the world soul. It's easier to love your family than to love every other family. But I mean,
Right.
it's a starting point where if you can express that sort of unconditional love informed by experience of divine love, then it's a good starting point, and maybe you can expand it in order to have a sense of the world soul, and by extension, you'd have sympathy for all people. Yeah.
But we must also remember that it's a different era, right? Where maybe people's relationships with, not that relationships with families is easy now. It's hard to love our family. Let's be honest. How many of us think that it's so easy to love those that we're born into versus the friends we choose? And I'm thinking of potentially like a time where this is a male audience, where siblings had some level of rivalry when it came to inheritance, to primacy in a patriarchal structure. Also, your relation to extended family, and even and everybody else and your friends, and also as far as like the wife, if you approach with this orientation toward the good and the way you love, perhaps taking into consideration what he already said about beauty, perhaps there is less of a, you can be less predisposed to sleeping with other women as well, which obviously at the time I think men, could do that with much more impunity than now. But to orient yourself where you're caring and love toward this specific woman, you recognize is no different than the hypothetical loves you could have if you had a true connection and a true love with other women, and that the sexual aspect is not the relevant aspect, and the beauty that you might see in others is the same beauty that is in your own wife.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a good assessment, I think. Very positive.
Perhaps I'm romanticizing it a little bit, but I think I'm trying to also read this in context of everything else that he's already said, right? This is not to be taken into a vacuum. He just, as he's writing or lecturing, he just tries to address it's the same concept, right? Every week we're talking about the same thing, but just oriented toward different aspects, different phenomena that we either experience as human beings or other phenomena that he presents as in his worldview.
And I think fundamentally there is a sort of goal in mind with all of this, and it goes
Mhm.
back to what I've been saying. It's a meditative or contemplative practice where it's not philosophy for the sake of mental games or discussion or even morality, but really all of this is encouraging somebody to seek the higher good, and
Right.
you have to modify your life appropriately in order to be in the right mindset, in the right emotional and psychological state before you can proceed to ascend effectively. And the end result will be presumably inherently better than if you're just living an ordinary life driven by material desires and seeking after material pleasures.
Right.
So,
He's using he's using the legacy of reason that's presented by Socrates through Plato's work, or maybe the historical Socrates, but really the logic and reason he presents is not really for the goals of more of material reason and knowledge that perhaps the historical Socrates or the Socrates as presented in Plato is going toward. His is using logic just to make an argument for things that are beyond reason, for things that are really, his is a philosophy of ontology and ethics to transform your very being. And he does not, even though he uses reason for his arguments, the actual practice is not one of just pure reason or rationalism. It's one that goes much deeper and is much more mystical.
Oh yeah, I mean it's definitely a practice of mysticism, because you're
Yes.
effectively trying to return or orient yourself toward the one, and that's definitely could definitely qualify that as mysticism. But I think if you were to follow this program, or even just be influenced by it, then, or allow yourself to be influenced by it, then you'll probably just start making adjustments to your life, your behavior, and maybe you will start to see a divine love, or you'll see beauty as not just something that's formatted in some sort of material composition, like for example a beautiful person, but rather you start seeing this image of or this sort of vision of the forms as being really the true beauty. And so
Right.
and then your mind presumably will be transformed through that. And I mean,
I think these are notions that most people actually have, but they don't have words to them, and how important words are to actually formulate thoughts, right? I think as human beings, and in the way that he talks about it, or like even the collective unconsciousness of the Jungian concept, which is totally different language from the 20th century, but it does share some things with the cosmic oneness that he presents. Some of these ideas are, they're always in there. They're always already there. But for us here and in our brain, like, you need words to then be able to start thinking about those things. So I think they're not completely new ideas to anybody, but in a way, maybe they have forgotten them, right? And reading this makes you think about it and then really develop the thought in your mind, and perhaps realize that you do think that. You just didn't really ever take the time. You didn't have the words for it, and you didn't stop to think about it. But I think that is true of any philosophy worth the term, right?
Right. Right.
Well, I think that we've done one of the most expeditious episodes ever on covering love. So next week, we're going to talk about a completely different topic on the impassibility of things without bodies, which I think this is probably the beginning of a different conceptual section, which he's going to cover over a couple of chapters.
We're going to have to go back to the nature of the soul. So that'll be next time.
All right. Thanks so much again. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody. Bye-bye.